In terms of sort of classic literature, and I don't just mean classical, I mean everything, the whole works, Jane Austen, Dickens, the thing. Herodotus was my first love, and that was because when I was about 10, I got terribly into Greek warfare, particularly the Battle of Thermopylae. And so I realised I was going to have to read about Herodotus, who is our main source for the Battle of Thermopylae. And I went to the library, got out these 2 volumes, huge, great text, and read them through. And it actually takes quite a long time to get to the Battle of Thermopylae, because Herodotus is essentially, what he's giving us is an enormous shaggy dog story. And I read it with some perplexity and some frustration. But what's happened since then is that I've found that he's one of those authors that just accompanies you throughout your life. And so all the stuff that when I was 10 and wanting to get to the Battle of Thermopylae, I was finding rather extraneous, now I find, if anything, even more interesting than the Battle of Thermopylae. So as I say, he is a writer who has accompanied me throughout my life, and I have keep returning to him. As you say, I dramatised him for Radio 4. I adapted him for Book at Bedtime. I wrote a book of history based very much on his histories, Persian Fire, and now I've had the chance to translate him. So I've probably lived in a greater degree of intimacy with Herodotus than with any other single writer. I think he's entertaining in the way that, say, a rolling radio news programme is entertaining, or indeed surfing the internet is entertaining, because essentially what he's doing is rather similar. He is conveying information. And before I get on to the entertainment, I'll just say how moving and powerful that idea is, because really he's the first person to do that, to think that the world can be expressed in terms of what we know about it. So he's sort of groping his way to trying to give us a portrait of the entire world as it exists. And so that in itself, I think, is very entertaining, because you're watching someone 2,500 years ago trying to work out what he knows. And sometimes he gets it right, and that's very exciting, and sometimes he gets it spectacularly wrong, and that also is very amusing. And what drives him to do that, essentially, is an absolutely inexhaustible curiosity. And so the basis of what makes him entertaining is the fact that, essentially, he is interested in everything. He's interested in the great power politics that forms the sort of spine of his history, but he's also completely fascinated in details of how different people conduct sexual relationships, how the Scythians get stoned, how and why the Egyptians keep cats, how the Indians get hold of their gold. He's interested in the way that different countries have different animals. He tells us extraordinary stories ranging from the horrible, an account of the terrible revenge that a eunuch takes on the man who had castrated him, to stories that still have an ability to make you smile. I mean, there's a wonderful story of a man who totally messes up his prospects of getting married to a very eligible girl by dancing upside down on a table. So there is something there for everyone. And you read through it wondering, well, what is he going to come up with next? And you are rarely disappointed. Hysteria, when Herodotus is writing, doesn't have the meaning that it has for us, history. It gets that meaning in Greek about 100 years on, largely due to Herodotus. But he is inquiring, he is researching, that's what he's doing. And he does actually set out very clearly his methodology. He says over and over again that I have asked people, I'm relying, and he indicates where he's relying on hearsay. And that's why it's always interesting when he name checks his sources. I mean, sometimes it's enough to send a shiver down the spine. You get the account of someone who spoke to a Persian on the eve of a great battle, and you get the sense, you know, this is a veteran speaking. This is first-hand testimony coming to us from 2,500 years ago, and that's amazing. At other times, you get the sense that his informants are really pulling his leg. I mean, sort of his account of the building of the Great Pyramid, for instance, on one level it's surprisingly accurate. He gets the name of the king right and all that kind of stuff. But he gets told by his informants, his Egyptian informants, that the tiny pyramids that stand in front of the Great Pyramid, that one of them was built by Cheops is the pharaoh's daughter, and that she had funded this pyramid by prostituting herself, and because she was the king's daughter, she was able to charge her clients an enormous amount of money. And Herodotus says, I'm not entirely convinced by this, but this is what I've told, so I'm going to tell it. And you think, well, kudos on him for allowing his leg to be pulled and for facing up to it. And then at other points you get a sense both of how modern he is in his attitude to his sources and how incredibly distant. For instance, there's an account about how a Spartan king called Cleomenes goes mad and he gets locked up by the Spartans, and in the morning he is found dead, and he had got hold of a knife, we're told, and had sliced off his feet and then hacked the flesh off his calves and then his thighs and then his groin, and then finally he started hacking open his stomach, and at this point, understandably, he dies. And Herodotus says, well, why did this happen? What provoked the wrath of the gods? And he gives the opinion of the Athenians, of the Corinthians, of the Spartans themselves, as to what impiety Cleomenes had committed that resulted in this hideous madness that drove him to kill himself. But the thing that Herodotus never asks himself, which to us seems so obvious, is, well, possibly he was murdered. Never crosses his mind. It's the will of the gods. And so there is that sort of that scientific approach to sifting evidence, to asking for, weighing up different opinions, and then on the other hand, taking for granted that there is some kind of manifestation of divine justice here. The thing that kind of makes it easier to translate Herodotus is that centuries after he died, scholars in the great Library of Alexandria divided his text up into 9 books and then divided each of the books up into paragraphs. And the paragraphs are very variable length. So some are very short, just one sentence, and some are very long, sort of up to 3 or 4 pages. So what I did was to decide I was going to translate at least 1 paragraph every day. That would be the bare minimum. And so when I got a very short paragraph, I had the choice of, taking the rest of the evening off, or doing 2 or 3 more and banking them up, ready for those really long paragraphs. But it was a very good discipline. Come my birthday, come Christmas, come holiday, I would do at least 1 every day. And it was kind of like, I suppose, a sort of a mental fitness regime. It was like doing your exercises every day. And that when I finished it, finally, it took me 5 years. When I finally finished it, I felt a sort of great sense of relief and achievement. But I did also feel a sense of bereavement, because there's a particular kind of pleasure to be had of living so intimately with a writer in another language. I mean, translation obliges you to think about a text far more deeply than any other way, and I miss him. And really, the relationship between a translator and a writer is akin to a marriage, and it's either make or break. And you come out of it either thinking, I never ever want to think about him again, or thinking, yeah, my love for him has been absolutely confirmed, and he remains, in my opinion, not just the most interesting, but the most lovable of writers. I think they lasted because they were felt to be innovative, that this was clearly a great work. Herodotus was described as essentially, he's the prose Homer, so he's a foundational text. But it's also because he is compulsively entertaining. The reasons that we find him interesting, people in antiquity did as well. And I think that just as my appreciation of him has evolved as I have got older over the course of my life, so Herodotus is the kind of writer that different ages have found different things to admire and appreciate. And so I would say that there's a particular reason now why Herodotus has sort of enjoyed a kind of popularity, particularly over the past 10, 20, 30 years. And it's to do with the fact that we live now in a much more multicultural world in which people of different backgrounds, different beliefs, different presumptions are constantly rubbing up against one another. And that's the kind of world that Herodotus inhabits. And he brings a very sane perspective to that. He tells this wonderful story about Darius the Great, the Persian king, who summons Greeks from the western margins of his empire and Indians from the eastern margins. And he asks the Greeks, who he knows burn their parents once they've died, what would it take me to pay you before you would eat your parents? And the Greeks throw their hands up in horror and say nothing. Then he turns to the tribe of Indians, who Herodotus tells us do eat their parents once they're dead, and says, what would it take for you to burn them? And the Indians likewise are absolutely horrified. And Herodotus draws the conclusion from this that custom is king, which is absolutely germane sort of perspective for us. But the thing that's really intriguing about it is that the man who is drawing this conclusion and who is sort of serving as the fulcrum of the entire anecdote isn't a Greek, it's a Persian king. It's the king of the power that had actually invaded Greece. And Herodotus, as a Greek, is, when he's saying custom is king, is doing it through the prism of a Persian perspective. And I think that that is, coming from someone who wrote 2,500 years ago, is remarkably refreshing.